Kia ora, and welcome to the COVID-19 lecture series. I am delighted to be back for this particular lecture, and in this lecture I want to grapple with the question of what does it mean to build political futures within the context of COVID-19 transformations. So I will work through the key concepts of the culture-centered approach to specifically discuss the work of building socialist futures within the context of COVID-19, but more broadly then learning from the COVID-19 experience to imagine how we think about and materialize health, well-being, society, politics, economics. Now, many of the concepts that I'm going to cover in this particular lecture are also covered in the white paper, A Culture-Centered Approach to Pandemic Response, which is a CARE white paper and available on the CARE website as part of our COVID white paper series. So I welcome you to take a look at that and engage with some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about today. So to begin with, I will talk about this question of a socialist response and why specifically within the context of COVID-19, what we see as emerging evidence is the vitality and necessity of socialist organizing of health and healthcare, but more broadly then connecting to that question of health and healthcare, the urgency of socialist organizing of politics and economics. Then we will draw in from the culture-centered approach to discuss what does it mean to culturally center socialism, and from that then we will wrap up with discussing what kinds of socialist futures can we imagine that are grounded in some of the key tenets of the culture-centered approach. So as you can see, I will really do an overview of the contemporary political, economic, cultural response to COVID-19, but really what I hope will happen from that is that we will have an opportunity to talk about broader ideas for how we look at the future, particularly within the context of ongoing crises of climate change, perhaps crises of food insecurity that we are likely to see in the next years and the next decades as a result of the extreme neoliberalism in the midst of which we inhabit today. So in order to draw out my arguments, I will specifically for today's conversation particularly connect with examples from the South Indian state of Kerala. Now, for those of you that are familiar with the public health literature, you are conversant with the Kerala model. So a little bit of background on the Kerala model just as context. Within the broader democratic infrastructure of India, the state of Kerala today is ruled by the Communist Party of India, Marxist, which is a communist party organized within the democratic structure of India, which contests elections, and particularly within the state of Kerala, then you find that there are periods when the party is in power and there are times when it is out of power. So it really goes through that democratic shift in power. But the political organizing of Kerala within the context of the CPIM is situated within and anchored to socialist politics and organizing health, education, literacy, science within the broader questions of universal access, redistributions of resources, and particularly ensuring that these resources are available to the margins of the margins. So I will situate the success of the Kerala state, and the state of Kerala is often talked about as a successful example of a public health infrastructure that is organized around the principles of universal health. And this is certainly something we see in the realm of COVID-19 response, where when we look at the emerging evidence, Kerala emerges as a state that has dealt with COVID not only in terms of its management and in terms of the healthcare infrastructure that has responded to it, but also in terms of the prevention, the strong science communication infrastructure, and then the basic infrastructures of housing, of access to food, of access to the basic necessities like universal income, and particularly offering protection to the itinerant migrant workers in the state. Now, you juxtapose this within the context of and in the backdrop of the broader response to the margins, particularly the migrant workers across India, where you're quite familiar with the evidence that has emerged, which is that migrant workers have really struggled with their livelihoods, have really struggled with basic necessities like food, housing, especially as they have been expelled out into these open spaces, expelled from cities and private architectures and infrastructures that have no place for the precarious margins whose labor actually make up these spaces. So in this backdrop, Kerala really stands out as an example of socialist organizing that is committed to offering care to the margins of the margins, and particularly the margins that don't really have a say in the electoral politics, but still have a voice within the state's infrastructure of delivery and organizing of care. And I will talk about that a little bit in terms of who does and who does not have access to structures for making claims to processes of care. So what do we mean by socialist health organizing? And I want to begin by talking about a few key features that I think define the socialist principles of organizing healthcare. The first among them is a centralized state response, where the state is organized centrally to deliver public utilities, to deliver public infrastructures, and the state is held accountable to deliver these infrastructures to the people. The way in which I think about socialist health organizing then is also then deeply connected to the idea of democratic health organizing, where the state response is driven by democracy, and in that sense, the strong state delivering health and health care is also accountable to the people. It is accountable to the people because the people have ownership over state and state processes, and these processes have not been hijacked by private commercial interests, as we see in many democracies across the world, where private lobbies, private communication corporations that are running the advocacy work for transnational corporations, for the powerful, actually have hijacked the democratic processes. So within the context of socialist health organizing, then, these socialist processes are also distributed equally within democratic structures and democratic norms, and they are held accountable to these democratic structures and norms. And then the public infrastructures are driven by the state. So in this context, we talk about a strong state that is effective, but a strong state that is also democratized and is answerable to its people. And the public infrastructures in this way are also not only equally distributed, but are also accountable to the people. So if you think about health and healthcare, with a strong infrastructure for a public health system that delivers basic healthcare, but is also able to care for the health of the overall population, particularly the margins of the population. So state-driven public infrastructures of health and healthcare, therefore, have sufficient capacity, and this is really critical, the capacity to care for the needs of the people. Now, with the large-scale privatization of health infrastructures across the globe, which has often been catalyzed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, with state investments into health and healthcare depleting dramatically, what we find is that the state's capacity to care actually has been depleted dramatically, such that when you have a crisis such as COVID-19, the state is incapable of delivering this fundamental care to its people because there aren't enough beds in hospitals, because there aren't enough ventilators and basic resources available, because there aren't enough healthcare workers. So a neoliberal organizing that is driven by the logic of efficiency has also worked consistently to deplete the basic infrastructure. So in this backdrop, a socialist healthcare infrastructure has the capacity, both in terms of the tools and the materials of healthcare, the equipment that are needed, but also in terms of the labor, the adequate supply of doctors, of nurses, of healthcare workers who are themselves cared for and who have access to decent forms of protection at their place of work. So sort of overall, then, that healthcare structure is organized on socialist principles. Similarly, a state-driven public infrastructure accounts for a strong literacy. This certainly you see in the case of the state of Kerala, which stands out compared to the rest of India, where there is strong investment in education and literacy, and particularly in science literacy, which is also then based on this idea of democratizing science, that science does not belong to the few. Science does not belong to the realm of the powerful and the elite who should have access to it, but rather science and science infrastructure itself is a site for public participation and public voice. So when you create that basic literacy in the population, through a strong science infrastructure, you also create openings simultaneously for everyday people, and particularly for those at the margins of the margins, to participate in processes of science, and which, in the context of the culture-centered approach, we talk about as the concept of agency, the ability to demonstrate and to perform various acts of negotiating within the context of structures. So a strong science literacy structure also enables democratic participation in science-based processes, where these are not just limited to the elites and the experts, but these become part of everyday life and infrastructures. You have, therefore, a strong public infrastructure for science. So within the context of the state of Kerala, we, for instance, think about the various science education programs and science communication programs, and many of which are run by the Communist Party of India, Marxist, or organizations associated with the CPIM, become ways in which people participate, communities participate, and their basic scientific literacy is raised at the same time. A state-driven public infrastructure also ensures that every citizen has access to the fundamental necessities of food. But there I also mark this notion of citizenship to argue further that every person within that context of the state has access to the fundamentals of food. So we also have to think about and question the logic of citizenship as the basis for organizing the delivery of public infrastructures, because often it is actually through citizenship that neoliberal states organize economies and organize labor such that they rely on the work of migrant labor, of precarious labor, who then they don't have to care for. So if we are talking about a form of socialist health organizing that addresses the pandemic, we have to think about what are the ways in which we decenter this notion of a state accountable and serving those that are legitimately marked as citizens, and really then ask what happens to those that are non-citizens and therefore are often considered as dispensable. And we have to extend our realms of theorizing to create spaces of care that are inviting, that are opened up, and that create pathways for representation and access for those that are considered disposable in the neoliberal economy. And similarly, what are state-driven public infrastructures for work and for income, where a basic universal wage is guaranteed to everyone, which allows everyone to cope with crises such as the one we are in the midst of, and actually be able to still live well amidst crises. So, connecting these fundamental concepts of socialist health organizing with the key conceptual tool of the culture-centered approach, which is the argument that structural inequalities work hand in hand with communicative inequalities. The question then I will grapple with is, what does socialist organizing look like when we anchor it in the key tenets of the culture-centered approach? So let's go back to this concept that communicative inequalities and health inequalities are tied in with the material and structural inequalities. What that then means is that the forms of marginalization in health and healthcare that we observe in our work are produced by the interplays of both communicative marginalization and structural marginalization. In many ways, structural marginalization and structural inequality in the distribution of material resources, inequalities in the distribution of political and economic opportunities, constitute communicative inequalities, which is inequalities in distribution of information, information resources, inequalities in distribution of voice and voice resources. And in turn, these communicative inequalities, both in terms of information and voice-based inequalities, actually contribute to inequalities in the distribution of structural resources. So within the context of health, then the distribution of health and well-being resources, of neighborhood resources, of spaces of livelihood, of housing, of food, of access to work, these are all tied in with communicative inequalities and the distribution of communicative resources. In that sense, then, if you think about the CCA as a nodal register for conceptualizing socialist health organizing, what it points to is that when we look at distribution of public infrastructures and public resources, we must also center the question of voice. Whose voices are we hearing? Whose voices are we not hearing? Whose voices are being erased? Who has access to communicative infrastructures to raise their basic needs? And are those basic needs being met? And what are the communicative infrastructures that are necessary in order to ensure that those needs are met. So we have to really think about the ways in which voice opportunities are distributed in society, and therefore consider the question of democracy as we broadly think about principles of socialist health organizing. Moreover, the culture-centered approach argues then that the concept of voice, and particularly the struggle for voice at the margins in communities that have limited access to structural resources for health and well-being, is tied to or is situated in the midst of the interplays of culture, referring to the everyday context of meaning making, everyday context of sense making, the dynamic and mobile values, norms that are shifting on an ongoing basis, but that also offer the substratum on which individuals, households, communities make meaning, make sense, and act, which then is tied to the idea of agency, which is the everyday active negotiation of one's context that one finds themselves in, the everyday meaning making that one participates in. And tied to that then both individual level and collective level actions that are practiced, that are embodied in order to both negotiate structures as well as in order to transform them. So what are structures? Structures are the systems of organizing of resources. So within the context of health, we can think about the ways in which health resources are organized, the ways in which health resources are distributed. So agency and structure in that sense are intertwined, because the ways in which an individual, a household, or a community negotiates a structure is by expressing agency, by making sense of the structure, and then by crafting certain sets of actions, whether they are spontaneous or whether they are planned, in order to negotiate the structures, but also to transform them, to resist them, to challenge them, to imagine forms of action that would bring about new structures. So in that sense, expressions of agency are both accommodating of and work with structures, and at the same time seek to resist and challenge structures, wanting to bring about change in them. So connecting this all back to COVID response then, and if we try to make sense of the ways in which socialist organizing can be connected to the culture-centered approach, the question then becomes one of asking what are the opportunities for communities at the margins of the margins to express their agency while making sense of their everyday lived contexts, in order to both negotiate the various health structures, structures of work and employment, structures of food, housing that they find themselves in, and what are the opportunities for them to actually participate in decision-making processes so that they can challenge and transform these structures. So connecting all this to the question of health response amidst a pandemic, we ought to be asking what are the sites in which cultural meanings offer the basis for inverting the dominant meanings of health, but also that offer avenues for socializing health, for distributing it equally in society, for ensuring access to health at the margins of the margins. So health response in this sense is embedded within the cultural context. That is the first point we have to really work through, which is to say that culture matters, cultural context matters, cultural meanings matter. It is, after all, through these meanings that individuals, households, community members make sense of their everyday context. And it is through these meanings that they script out various forms of actions in negotiating the context. Community agency at the margins of the margins are vital, both in terms of thinking through how we can listen to these enactments of community agency, but also how do we create pathways for community agency to be expressed, to create opportunities for democratization and democracy. To think of science as radical democracy, which means how do we build infrastructures for science that are anchored in communities, where communities have access to the science, where communities can own those spaces of science information, where communities can participate in science-related decision making. And in this sense, then, really the question becomes one of not simply how, as we think about in the dominant science communication literature, about how we engage communities at the margins. The question in the culture-centered approach that we ask is, beyond the idea of engagement, how do we build infrastructures for communities to democratically participate? And how do we, through this process, then create spaces for community voice and ownership of response processes? So when you think about COVID-19, all the way from the COVID tests to the wearing of masks and the distribution of masks, to the distribution of soaps, hand sanitizers, the distribution of water, to following the 1 meter physical distancing guideline. How can these kinds of science-based decisions be anchored in community voice, in community democracy, is a key challenge. And when we look at the example of Kerala, I think what we see is that when you have democratized the science infrastructure, you have built the spaces for communities to participate in enacting their agency, in making everyday decisions, such as the decision to stay home, the decision to wear a mask, that are informed by science, but that also serve as opportunities for enacting agency. So the distribution of science infrastructures in society democratically, based upon socialist principles, enables the participation of communities in following preventive crisis response strategies. And in this sense, then, community participation itself becomes structurally transformative, such that the question of structure is placed at the center. So when you think about the Kerala response, structurally at the margins of the state were the migrant workers. So considering carefully how do we build infrastructures where the migrant workers can have a voice, as well as where the migrant workers can have access to basic resources of prevention and care, all the way from masks and cleaning supplies, to be able to live in conditions where they can practice the 1 meter physical distance, where they can have access to healthy food. These are all critical questions that are connected to this notion of creating spaces for structural transformation. And through all this, then, the CCA creates meaning registers for structurally transforming the hegemonic capitalist organizing of health and healthcare, because what it points to is that the very idea of care ought to be rooted in the questions of redistribution, equal distribution, and to universal access to these basic public resources, including the resources for voice. So Let's take a couple of examples of these community infrastructures as we wrap up this conversation. One of the examples that I want to point out is the community food kitchens that were run by the Communist Party of India, Marxist, across the state of Kerala. You also see this in the state of West Bengal, where the CPIM has a strong political presence within the social context, not in the electoral context, but in the social context, certainly, where community participation has been organized as a way to anchoring the fundamental socialist register for universal food access. Through the organizing of these community spaces to make food and to bring it, to serve it as a structure for care to the margins of the margins, so that your itinerant migrant workers, so that those that haven't been able to find work still have access to fundamental resources of food, and supported by, and this is the key point here, supported by not just volunteer activities. Of course, these volunteering activities are critical in terms of organizing community responses and a site for community responses, but more fundamentally supported by state, a socialist state organizing, where the state invests in significant public distribution resources to bring food to people. And again, not just to its citizens, but to its itinerant workers, to its migrant workers. So the socialist state, in this sense, is a caring state. Is a state that is reorganized into an infrastructure of care that is accountable to everyone in a universal sense as a structure for public welfare. So this kind of reorganizing of community infrastructure, you see, is based upon the principle of solidarity, rather than on the principle of divisiveness, on the principle of marking the other, which are some of the fundamental characteristics of the right, of the neoliberal organizing resources that are busy propping up the other, be it the migrant worker, be it the Asian other, or be it the Muslim other in the context of India, in order to deplete public welfare, really. So within the context of a community infrastructure that is anchored in the key tenets of the culture-centered approach, and that is committed to a socialist politics, these public infrastructures are universally accountable. The question then really becomes, how do we build community spaces that connect with these notions of universally accountable state infrastructures and push for that? And I think what lies at the center of that is the principle of solidarity and universal care, that these public resources are meant to be constructed and created in ways such that they universally care for everyone. So health infrastructures then, and again I come back to the Kerala example to walk through it, is based upon strong state investment in public health. And one of the ways in which you can actually measure this is to look at the amount of GDP that is invested in health and healthcare. But more importantly, you can also look at issues such as the delivery of healthcare, health organizations. Are these supported by public structures? Are these supported by the state? Does the state actually run with significant investments into public health infrastructures and into the delivery of public health care? To what extent is this evidence-based? And again, that comes back to the question of democracy and democratization of science. So on one hand, you are building an evidence-based practice that is anchored in democracy. And on the other hand, you are creating opportunities for community participation and dialogic conversations with cultural norms and everyday cultural context. So it is important that these health infrastructures be rooted in the voices of the margins, and particularly in the voices of the margins, those typically that are likely to be erased, those who are not likely to be counted, those who are likely to be quickly othered. So the principle of care has to fundamentally reorganize healthcare systems such that their commitments turn toward the margins of the margins, to those that are most likely to be erased. And it is through that process we build socialist health systems. So the ethic of care, at the heart of it, is about universalizing the principles of care and about redistributing these principles of care by actually organizing them in universal logics. So we have to really, in that sense, and COVID-19 certainly makes this evident, that we have to dismantle notions of citizenship as the basis for organizing the distribution of public resources. Often states turn into, particularly neoliberal states, turn into arguments such as, oh, we have limited capacities and our commitment is first and foremost to the citizens. Now, of course, when you critically interrogate this narrative, one of the first things you recognize is that, in fact, most of the infrastructures of these neoliberal economies are built upon the work, the labor, and often underpaid or unpaid labor of migrant workers or precarious workers, of itinerant workers. So to have universal care is to reorganize the very principles of how we want our societies to be and how do we want our public infrastructures to be organized, and to center the concept of care in those processes and in those conversations. So culture-centered socialisms, in this sense, are socialisms that are committed to building strong socialist state formations that actually have strong basic infrastructures for health and well-being, and health and well-being here really being broad, so going beyond health and healthcare to science, to housing, to food, to universal income or universal wage. They are anchored in radical democracies in communities where the science infrastructure itself is democratized and communities have openings for participating in decision-making process based upon emergent evidence, and where communities participate as evidence makers in those processes of engaging with evidence, where community ownership at the margins of margins transforms health organizing processes, preventive resources, food resources, housing resources, where science is democratized, public health is democratized, where everyone has an opportunity to participate in decision making, to participate in forms of organizing in order to construct the kinds of infrastructures they would like to see that serve their health and well-being, and where public and collective reflexivity are built into the structure. Now, socialist organizing without voice democracy turns into totalitarian systems without accountability to people. And the ways in which the culture-centered approach sort of addresses this question of socialist organizing is by foregrounding the role of reflexivity, continually interrogating who is at the margins of the margins, who is being erased, whose voices are we not hearing, but more importantly, whose voices are we not hearing, which voices are missing from these discursive spaces, in order to create openings for voices, particularly at the margins of the margins. So public and collective reflexivity is about turning this process of interrogating who is here, who is participating, who is not here to an open-ended question that is accountable to the people, that is transparent in the sense of creating openings for people to question the decision-making processes, and that is public in the sense of publics having ownership over those processes of reflexivity. So I will wrap up then by noting today, and we walk through the Kerala model of COVID-19 response, and the argument I will make today is that if we witness the Kerala model of COVID response, we see the ways in which socialist organizing of public infrastructures played a key role in Kerala's strong response. But that socialist organizing was not just limited to a strong public health and the delivery of healthcare, but it was also connected to a strong education system. It is connected to a strong science literacy base, a strong community participation, and then public infrastructures of food and housing that enabled an overarching and a global response to COVID-19. The Kerala model is just one window for us to think about how we want to organize our societies as we grapple with COVID-19 transformations. And with culture-centered conversations, I believe that the way to think about those transformations of healthcare, of our societies is by looking at the question of voice democracy, coming back to the concept of communicative inequality, and connect it to questions of socialist organizing in terms of redistribution of resources. So voice democracy and socialist organizing together through sort of the politics of radical democracy at the margins of the margins can, I believe, contribute to healthcare systems that are organized to care and that are organized to address crises effectively. Thank you so much for participating in this conversation. I will now jump online. If you have any comments or questions, please do put them in the feed, and I would love to converse with you further. Thank you so much.